All right, welcome back, everybody, to another so enjoyable episode of Let's Do the Math. And there's not going to be a lot of visuals other than this math and these numbers. There's not going to be any Bill Nye animations or whatever. So mostly audio, like always, although the numbers are on screen to be seen. So if you want to just listen to the numbers while doing something else or working on something else, that's probably advisable. But regardless, today we are doing some math about whether or not we actually can take a population of 10 billion, which is what we're expected to have, or around where we're expected to be by the middle of the century. You know, the answer very well could be a resounding yes if we all lived in like fourth world nation living standards and just lived in like 10 square foot outhouse sized shacks and all ate like one bowl of rice as our one meal per day. But we don't want to live in squalor and poverty's version of poverty. We want to actually have, enjoyable living standards. So this is the question that is what's actually being asked. Can the world support a population of 10 billion people at first world living standards? So we're going to find the answer today that we already know, and it's not the cheerful answer. So we're going to start by looking at one of our most important things to our modern civilization, petroleum. Our liquid fuel, our source of petrochemicals, our source of so many things that we use to make so many things. So, as we go, we're also going to have different standards of first world living because, things are different in different first world countries. In some, like the US, for example, there's a lot more driving, there's a lot more personal vehicle ownership versus places like the EU or the UK, where a lot more people walk around and take public transport, but, they're still first world countries. So, for our first analysis here, the US is about at a population of 330 million right now, or just below it, and has a oil consumption level pushing around 22 million barrels per day. So you divide that out, you get a rough average of 1 million barrels per day per 15 million people. That's with, a US type first world living standard where like a lot of people own cars and everything and a lot of people drive around. And the UK or EU standard is, I used the UK specifically. They have a consumption level of about 1.6 million barrels per day for a population of about 70 million or a little below it, which comes out roughly to about 1 million barrels per day for every 45 million people. So then to figure everything out from there, all you have to do is some simple division. 10 billion divided by 15 million gives you 667. So, to live at the U.S. first world living standard, the world at a population of 10 billion would need to consume 667 million barrels per day. Yeah, that ain't gonna work. Now, even at the EU standard, it's still a lot. You divide 10 billion by 45 million, and you get about 222 million barrels per day would need to be our consumption level for European Union first world living standards for a population of 10 billion people on this earth. Now, it could be a lot lower. It could be something more feasible. Because if all ground transportation is converted over to electric vehicles, which is still impossible because there's not enough nickel, there's a link up in the corner right now, and I really actually do mean this time. You need to see that, the video that's linking to, where we go over math related to the Green New Deal and why all electric everything isn't going to work. However, if it did, in a hypothetical scenario, We get rid of all ground transport demand for liquid fuel, and we're left with where it is necessary. Jet fuel, marine fuel for large vessels and such, and petrochemical synthesis. Their percentages of which of total oil demand are right here, 6%, 6%, and 16%, which total to 28%. And in the more optimistic number, 222 million barrels per day, we'll use that one, and needing only these three left, take 28% of 222 million barrels per day, and we get 62 million barrels per day is what we could only need for a population of 10 billion people living at European Union first world living standards, if there actually was enough nickel on Earth to go all electric for all ground transportation. Unfortunately, there's not. But this is, a what-if scenario. So, what if? Okay, so over to electricity. Now, we have a variety of things here. First, we're going to tackle the total amount of electricity needed for a population of 10 billion to live at first world living standards. But of course, that can be different from place to place. Like, for example, comparing the US to Australia. So Australia has a consumption of about 200 gigawatts per 25 million people. Has a consumption level of about 1 terawatt per 71 million people. So we use these different standards. You have 10 billion, you divide it by 25 million, and you get 400. 400 times 200 gigawatts gives you 80 terawatts at Aussie standard, Australian standard. 10 billion people on Earth at Australian first world living standards would need about 80 terawatts of electricity constantly being provided. At US electricity consumption levels, 10 billion divided by 71 million, get 140 roughly times 1 terawatt, and you get obviously 140 terawatts needed constantly for a population of 10 billion. And just for some other comparisons with these later numbers, I just threw in this up here, the UN's estimate of how much electricity the world is going to be consuming by 2040. That's not to supply the entire 10 billion people that we'll have by 2050. That's not even supplying every one of the 9 billion people we'll have by 2040. That's just how much they think we'll be consuming by 2040. Now, the middle number in here, this is how many terawatts above our current global consumption level that each number would be. Currently, global electricity consumption is about 27 terawatts. So to get to the 80 terawatt mark under the Aussie standard for 10 billion people, we'll over time need to add another 53 terawatts of electricity capacity. Under the US standard, we need another 113 terawatts. Now, just between now and 2040, according to the UN, at least their estimate, we're already going to be adding about another 13 terawatts because they expect us to be at 40 terawatts by 2040. And here, I threw in the additional amount of copper required to create that much additional electricity grid. The rough formula so far is that about 700 or so million tons of copper has been mined up to this point in history, and roughly about 60% of copper is used in the electrical sector. So 60% of 700 is about 420 million tons. Compared to our current power consumption, that gives us, again, roughly 420 million tons required for every 27 terawatts. So, the additional amounts, this isn't total, this is the amount here required for the additional capacity needed to be added to reach each of the top numbers. So, just under our current reality projections from the UN to get up to 40 terawatts by 2040, which is most likely going to happen, we are going to consume, just to add that additional electrical capacity to the world and additional electricity consumption, we're going to consume another 202 million tons of copper. Now, to supply electricity at Aussie first world living standards to all 10 billion theoretical people, we would need to consume an additional 824 megatons of copper to create all that additional electricity capacity. And under the US standard, we would need to consume 1.75 billion tons of additional copper. So down here, I also threw in our total current numbers, total known reserves of copper. For anyone who doesn't know, the difference between reserves and resource in mining or in oil drilling. Reserves are what we know is there and is currently gettable, is currently extractable. The resource is the reserves and everything else. It's the entirety of what we know is out there. But the total resource is, that's whether we can actually get to it and extract it or not. That's just what we know is there, period. And then you also have theoretical resource, which is estimates of how much could be in places that we've never actually surveyed, the northern Canadian territories for, say, potential copper deposits, stuff that may lie under the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets that we're obviously not going to be getting at, and stuff that, could lie near the surface of the sub-ocean crust. If we ever decide that it's worth it to just start dredging up the ocean floor to see what we can get. So total current copper reserves globally are about 830 million tons in the ground that we know we can mine and we're going to mine. Total resource known currently is about 2.1 billion tons. So, total resource, not a problem for any of the numbers. The US standard requirement would start getting close and would actually pass up that number if you included other uses of copper. And then the total theoretical resource of copper is really roughly, because again, it's theoretical, is really roughly estimated at about 5.6 billion tons, maybe, including all the potential far out stuff, like northern Canada, middle of Siberia, the ocean floor. But so, that's that for electricity needs. Now we move over to natural gas. The thing we are going to be constantly replacing coal-fired power plants with. So, this is our current estimates here. At present, I forgot to include, so I'll type it up here. At present, the world consumes about 324 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. And at present, I believe a bit over 30% of world electricity generation comes from natural gas. Coal still generates around 40%. And so the current aim of many nations is to replace their coal-fired power plants with natural gas. So we have our different theoretical power numbers here. Well, 2 real and our 1 theoretical. And at a very, very rough estimate of about 1 billion cubic feet of natural gas required per day per 46 gigawatts of power generation. All right, so to do this, starting off with the current global electricity consumption, about 27 terawatts. If it were to be brought up to 40% global electricity production from natural gas under our current numbers, natural gas consumption for power generation globally would be about 234 billion cubic feet per day. And we get that by doing 40% of 27, so 0.4 times 27, you get 10.8. Divide that by 46 gigawatts, so 0.046, and you get roughly 234. And then you repeat the process for each of the numbers, just substituting. So if we theoretically Thanos snapped current global power generation up to 50% being from natural gas, then you would just replace the 0.4 in the first part there with a 0.5 instead. And the end result number would be that would require 293 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas consumption by the power generating sector. So 60% natural gas, for power generation at our current global electricity consumption levels would require 352 billion cubic feet per day, which itself, just for the power generation sector, would be more than the total amount of natural gas overall that is currently consumed each year. Under the 2040 UN projections, where we're going to be consuming about 40 terawatts, then to have 40% natural gas generation for that would require about 347 billion cubic feet per day. Half natural gas power generation globally, 434 billion cubic feet per day, and 60% of global electricity produced from natural gas at 40 terawatts of electricity capacity would require over 500 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. And under the everybody has first world living standards Aussie style 80 terawatts, 40% of that being natural gas, would require just under 700 billion cubic feet per day. 50% of that being natural gas would require just under 870 billion cubic feet per day, and 60% natural gas for a global power generation under 80 terawatts. Everybody's at first world standards, everybody's happy, would require over 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas per day, just for the power sector. So, moving on from that, let's go to food. Now, the worry has always been about how much arable land we're using and stuff, arable land being land that is actually suitable to grow food on. And when or around we hit 7 billion people, the amount had been put out that we were at roughly 60% of the world's arable land was being used by humanity. And so just using that as a rough equivalence, 60% for every 7 billion people, then theoretically at 10 billion people, we will be using about 85%. So, that obviously doesn't sound too bad. That still leaves 15% arable land to play with. However, as I obviously noted here, that assumes that the remaining 15% is still 15%. This is not accounting for any arability loss, any loss of arable land to flooding, sea level rise, desertification, all kinds of stuff. Now, phosphate rock, the thing that feeds us all. We currently consume about 270 megatons per year for a population of about 7.6 billion. That was the 2018 numbers, during which we had a population of 7.6 billion. We're at 7.7 now, but the 2019 numbers don't come out until the USGS publishes their data in February. So using that as scalability, 270 megatons per 7.6 billion people for a population of 10 billion, we will need 355 megatons of phosphate rock per year. Can Morocco provide it? Because we're all going to become dependent upon Morocco. We'll have to see. However, we are going to reach the problem of individual nations having peaked, many of which have. The U.S. has. We're on our way down. And basically, once those phosphate reserves in Central Florida are exhausted, that's about it for us, unless we decide to deforest all of western North Carolina to dig up the phosphate reserves under those lower Appalachia mountains. So, will global phosphate production peak before reaching 355 million tons per year? Maybe, maybe not. Will it peak? Yes. Will it then fall too quickly below 355 million tons per year? I don't know. We'll end up seeing. Now, there are proposed methods and mechanisms for re-extracting phosphate from agricultural runoff, from food waste, from, sewage. However, kind of similar to desalination plants, those processes would require a fair bit of energy, which would, just crank up our energy use. Along with the potential arable land limitation solutions, which have been proposed as indoor farms, growing plants via, intense artificial lighting and stuff, and, running constant water and nutrient circulation, a whole bunch of stuff that would constantly increase our power usage on top of the projections that we have already done and already exist. Now, I also threw in lumber just for a land area need calculation, and I did a few things for it. The current average first world estimate is that the average person, or maybe not necessarily the person, but just society per person, consumes about 50 rolls of toilet paper per year. So, 1 times 50 times 10 billion gives you 500 billion rolls. And using the conservative estimate, just to give ourselves the least amount of leeway, you can get about 1,100 rolls out of an average lumberyard tree. And that would require about 450 million trees per year. And based off of some stuff I read from different lumber producing companies, the average among them, amongst their different tree farms that they operate, because obviously, for, the lumber companies in each region, they grow different trees, and different trees grow at different rates and grow to different sizes at different rates. But they said the average across all their different tree farms is about 34 years for each batch of trees to mature to harvestability levels. So that would mean a 34-year total cycle, which would mean 13.3 billion trees would constantly be in cycle and in use for toiletry paper production, and at one of their other shown averages of about 400 trees per acre. That leads to a requirement of about 38.2 million acres. And then for regular tissue paper, as in blow your nose type tissue paper, it is averaged that at first world living standards, society consumes about 24 boxes worth per person per year. So 24 times 10 billion gives you 240 billion. And about 1,700 tissue boxes makeable per tree. That gives a need of about 140 million trees per year, times the 34-year cycle, gives a need of about 4.76 billion trees constantly in a cycle going through, being used for tissue paper, which yields about 11.9 million acres, the total of which is about 50.1 million acres, which is about 202,000 square kilometers. That's a little less than 5% of the size of the U.S. Now, personal paper items, that's hygiene items and stuff. So that's not actually what causes the majority of lumber consumption. So the personal hygiene paper items is only about 10% of average lumber consumption. So if we assume that's 10%, then it wouldn't just be the 202,000 square kilometers, it would be about 2 million square kilometers. That's approaching half the size of the US. The total amount of people so far at first world living standards out of the 7.7 billion of us here, that depends, because there's a lot of argument about what you would consider first world living standards, blah, blah, blah. So it's a range, basically based on your own personal considerations. It's a range of between 2 and 3 billion. All right, so then we go over to infrastructure, in which we deal with something that is ever abundant yet ever not. I decided to do industrial sand, classified as sand and gravel. And so there's different standards of infrastructure building and infrastructure maintenance. So we have the U.S. in the middle. The U.S. has, variety from state to state. So the U.S. is the average. And then you have semi-ish clinging on to first world status countries like Russia, where I've seen very interesting pictures from my friends that live there about Russian road maintenance and construction standards. And then you have China, or at least, again, the first world portions of China, so basically Eastern China, where everything is, keep it tight, keep it up, keep it on the mark. or you get disciplined, or the government disciplines you. So under the different potential standards, at 10 billion people living on Earth, under the Russian infrastructure building and maintenance standards, we would need to be consuming, based on their average, about 236 million tons per 140 million people, 16.8 billion tons of industrial-grade sand per year. Under the U.S. standard, you would need to be consuming about 29.4 billion tons of industrial-grade sand per year, and under the Chinese standard, a little bit more, at 32.9 billion tons per year. Why is this a problem, you say? Sand is practically infinite. It's everywhere. Yes, it is, but not industrial-grade sand. It is abundant, technically. There's a lot of it. It's just most of it we can't actually access, and extracting the parts we can potentially cause some problems, and already is causing some problems. All right, and then elsewise for infrastructure, we have steel consumption, which is mostly iron, but also usually at least about 1% carbon, aka coal. This time, for steel, we'll use Russia again. Sorry, guys. Sorry, any Russian viewers. Russia again. About 28.4 million tons of steel per 143 million people per year. Now, about 27% of steel is consumed in the automobile industry to produce vehicles. So we subtract that because we're not including the vehicles. We want the steel used to build everything else, like construction and such. So times 0.73, that drops it down to about 20.7 million tons per year per 143 million people. And then the other two are the U.S. standard, which is about 100 million tons per year per 330 million people, times 0.73 gives you, obviously, 73 million tons per year. And at the Japanese standard, you have 73 million tons per year per only 126 million people. But subtract the automobile production off of that, and it's only about 53 million tons per 126 million people. So, under the different standards, at a population of 10 billion, under the low infrastructure maintenance and construction standards of the Russian standard, we would need about 1.45 billion tons of steel each year. And it cannot only be produced from recycled steel or recycled iron, because there's always new stuff being made, and as stuff is built, it doesn't just instantly come into the recycling cycle. Stuff is used for a long time. So just for an average basis, even in the nations with like the highest recycling rate or the highest usage rate of recycled steel to make new steel, it's still usually about 30% of the mixture is fresh, newly mined iron. But regardless, just the total numbers, under the U.S. infrastructure and maintenance standard, for 10 billion people, we would be consuming about 2.21 billion tons of steel per year. And under the Japanese standard, for 10 billion people, we would be consuming 4.2 billion tons of steel per year. Okay, so now we get to silver. Silver. Okay, so silver has some problems. Silver production peaked back in 2015 from mines globally, and it has been falling ever since, while silver consumption is ever rising. Now, this first bit here, where we deal with solar panels, isn't entirely going to be population related. We're just going to show what is actually capable. So, and again, remember, this is accounting for no other usage of silver whatsoever. This is assuming that this is a fairyland where every other use of silver just disappeared. So, solar panels, for those who don't know, even although if you've watched even one of my videos, you really should know, because I bring this point up endlessly. Solar panels use silver. About 11 grams per square meter of solar panels. And a solar panel can produce about 170 watts per square meter. So you get about 11 grams per square meter. And then to figure things out from there, we have our little setup. So 1 kilowatt divided by 170 watts is about 5.88. So that's 5.88 square meters of solar panel required to generate a kilowatt of electricity. Again, using the latest, most efficient solar panels. Now, to bump those numbers up, a megawatt, you would multiply by 1,000. To get up to a gigawatt scale, multiply that number by 1,000,000. To get up to a terawatt scale, multiply that by 1,000,000,000. So for each terawatt of solar power electricity generation, you would be using about 5.88 billion square meters. And so 5.88 billion square meters times 11 grams, you get 64.8 billion grams. Divided by 1,000 to get kilograms, 64.8 million. Divided by 1,000 to get tons, 64.8 thousand tons of silver per terawatt of solar-powered capacity. So we come back over here, and we have our different potential scenarios. So to generate 1 terawatt of solar power, as said, we need 64.8 thousand tons of silver. To get up to 5 terawatts, we would need to use, and again, this silver would be locked in, 324,000 tons of silver. To get up to 8 terawatts, I rounded down by terawatts to the most possible based on reserve amounts. Total current silver reserves are about 560,000 tons left. 8 terawatts of solar capacity would require 518.4 thousand tons of silver, which would be, over 90% of all the remaining silver. And that would be, again, not allowing for any other uses of silver. This 784,000 tons of potential reserves thing, I carried that over from like my OPEC video where I did a theoretical, where I did a theoretical panned out thing, like we'll say an additional 40% on top of that of reserves is like discovered between now and then. Then that would, let us, again, not allowing for any other uses, that would let us get up to 12 terawatts of solar power at a consumption of 777.6 thousand tons of silver. So, way more silver by weight is used in each computer than gold. Gold is about 1 ounce for every 40 computers. Silver is 1 ounce per 6 computers. You have to remember that there are way many times more computers in and throughout the offices, hospitals, businesses, restaurants, and schools of our population than there are personally owned computers in people's homes. But it came out to about, again, including everything this time, businesses, schools, personal stuff, restaurants, it came out to about, at the time, this isn't current, this was in I think 2012, 2013, it came out to an estimated roughly 1 billion computer devices, and we'll just be a bit generous and say that it's still only that number for the current U.S. population of 330 million, because it was for devices in the U.S. And so to work from that, we're going to have several different scenarios. The population is 10 billion in all of them, again, but we'll have different scenarios, because under the U.S. standard, that would end up at full first world living everything, a population of 10 billion people would end up with about 30 billion computerized devices, theoretically. However, we'll also have 2 lower scenarios, just for, happy times. So, 1 ounce per 6 computers, 10 billion divided by 6, 1.67 billion divided by 16 ounces, get 104 million pounds divided by 2,200 pounds for tons, and you get 47.2 thousand tons of silver required per each 10 billion computers. And so down here, I also included the maximum amount of solar-powered terawatts that could be generated via, solar panels if that amount of silver was diverted into making computers. So 10 billion computers, a little over 47,000 tons of silver. That reduces the max potential solar power generation capacity to between 7 and 11 terawatts. And again, that is then assuming that just the electronics and the solar panels are the only uses of silver, and everything else just stops abruptly, which it won't. So 20 billion computers, 2/3 of the way to the actual standard. That's about 94,000 tons of silver, reduces total potential solar power capacity to 7 to 10 terawatts, again, allowing for no other uses of silver at all. And the actual standard, 30 billion computers for a population of 10 billion people at full first world living standards, gets you over 141,000 tons of silver, which reduces, allowing for no other silver uses, total potential solar power capacity to 6 to 10 terawatts. Okay, and then we have the vehicle scenario, which is the last one I did for this little fun math session. So there are different standards of amount of personal vehicles in a given nation. In the US, for example, there are about 81% as many personal vehicles as there are people. However, in other countries, it's much lower. Japan has only about a 61% personal vehicle equivalence to their population. The European Union is a little over half, about 55%, and South Korea has about 41%. So under these different percentiles, the different standards, the vehicle amounts that would be needed for a 10 billion population under South Korean first world living standards, that would only require about 4.1 billion vehicles. Under the European Union standards, 10 billion people would end up requiring about 5.5 billion vehicles. Japan, under Japanese standards, about 6.1 billion, and US standards, obviously, 8.1 billion. And also threw in various resource consumption amounts for that many vehicles. 4.1 billion vehicles would consume about 4.5 gigatons or billion tons of steel. 5.5 billion vehicles, 6 billion tons of steel. 6.1 billion vehicles, 6.7 billion tons of steel. And 8.1 billion vehicles, 8.9 billion tons of steel. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The amount of nickel required if all these vehicles were electric vehicles, which is the future that Green New Deal people want, and it's not going to work. 4.1 billion vehicles, average electric vehicle containing about 52 kilograms of nickel per vehicle. If these were all EVs, 4.1 billion would result in about 213.2 million tons of nickel being required. 5.5 billion vehicles under the EU standard would result in 286 million tons of nickel being required. The Japanese standard, 6.1 billion vehicles, would need 317 million tons of nickel. And for the US standard, 421 plus million tons of nickel. How do those numbers weigh out against the actual amount of nickel out there? Well, total current reserves of nickel are only about 84 million tons. Total known resource is about 130 million tons. And total theoretical resource, most of which is accounting for ocean floor deposits is about 260 million tons. And again, remember, this is accounting for no other uses of nickel being allowed, which would cripple society, because nickel is needed for most steel. It's what protects steel from corroding to the elements. And then copper, not so bad. It's about 183 pounds of copper per the average EV. So, just use the 1 billion to get our base mark, times 183 pounds, divided by 2,200 pounds, and we get about 83.1 million tons per 1 billion electric vehicles. So, under the South Korean first world standard, 41% personal vehicle ownership, you'd need about 340 million tons of copper for the 4.1 billion vehicles, and then the ascending numbers being 457 million tons, 506, just under 507 million tons, and 673 million tons. So, are we going to be able to actually, as most people desire, have everyone on Earth living at first world, modern, non-impoverished living standards at a population of 10 billion? No, it's not going to work. It was never going to work. Even before we consumed and wasted everything that we have up till now, it was still never going to work. Now, we can keep a population of a few billion or a couple billion, like 2, 3, at first world living standards for a pretty long period of time. 10 billion, it ain't going to work. Now, the 7.7 billion people we already have aren't at first world living standards. Again, it's only between 2 and 3 billion at the moment, and that can fluctuate. That's about it for this. Free to say any thoughts in the comments. Please like the video, at least if you enjoyed listening to everything. If you would like to, please help me out with the upcoming end of my health insurance less than a month from now. I have links to my PayPal, Patreon, and Redbubble shop. All that's in the description below. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you all around next time.